No one ever imagines that a single act of kindness could save an entire life, but that is precisely what happened to Walter when he decided not to fire his cook on that fateful early morning. What he didn't know was that this simple woman, who had worked silently in his home for 7 years, would be the only person capable of seeing the truth. Everyone else around him was hiding. While Walter built his empire over 3 decades of honest work, someone very close was scheming in the shadows to destroy everything, using his own goodwill as a weapon against him. This is the true story of how a dedicated CEO discovered that the people he trusted most harbored the darkest secrets, and how a humble cook became the unlikely heroine who saved not only his money but his very soul. Prepare yourself for a journey of betrayal, suffering and redemption that will make you rethink everything about trust, loyalty and the true value of the people around us. Stay until the end to discover the shocking twist no one saw coming, the one that changed everything forever. The clock read 3:15 a.m. when Walter parked his SUV in the garage of his Greenwood, Indiana home. At 52, the CEO of a successful packaging supply company was bone-tired after yet another meeting that ran far later than scheduled. The kitchen lights were on, which was strange for that hour. Walter felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he opened the door and found Elena, his 38-year-old housekeeper and cook, standing rigid in the center of the kitchen, her hands shaking. Clutched between her fingers was a prescription bottle of controlled medication he immediately recognized as belonging to Vivian, his wife. The silence that settled in that moment seemed to weigh tons. Elena had worked for the family for 7 years, always dedicated, always punctual, always discreet. Seeing the woman he trusted holding that bottle made Walter's stomach turn. Before Walter could utter a single word, Elena dissolved into tears. Her legs gave way, and she leaned against the kitchen counter, the vial nearly slipping from her grasp. The cook began to speak between sobs, explaining that her 16-year-old daughter, Jessica, was going through a terrible anxiety crisis. The episodes had worsened in recent weeks, and Elena didn't have enough money to buy the necessary medications. The desperation in the woman's eyes was so genuine, so palpable, that Walter felt something inside him break. He knew that kind of desperation. He knew what it was like to have no way out, no choice. Walter was known for his rigidity. After having been cheated by employees in the past, he had built high walls around his trust. Every previous betrayal had left deep marks on his soul, scars that constantly reminded him to maintain distance, never to let his guard down. But in that moment, seeing Elena utterly distraught before him, something different happened. Perhaps it was the hour, perhaps it was the exhaustion, or perhaps it was just the humanity he tried so hard to hide surfacing. He didn't shout. He didn't fire her on the spot as he would have under any other circumstance. Instead, he took a deep breath and made a proposition that surprised even himself. Elena could stay, but she would work weekends without extra pay until the cost of the medication was fully compensated. The cook accepted immediately, still crying, thanking him repeatedly in a choked voice. Walter went up to the master bedroom without looking back, feeling a strange weight in his chest. Vivian was sleeping soundly, her face serene in the dim light filtering through the window. He watched his wife for a few seconds before lying down quietly. 28 years of marriage should mean something, he thought. They should mean trust, complicity, partnership. But as he closed his eyes that morning, Walter couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. The following weeks passed in a routine haze. Walter plunged into factory work, dealing with orders, suppliers, and tight deadlines. Elena kept her word, arriving on Saturdays and Sundays to prepare meals, clean the kitchen, and organize the pantry. She worked in silence, eyes downcast, as if carrying the weight of her guilt in every movement. Walter rarely spoke to her beyond what was necessary, maintaining the professional distance that had always characterized his relationship with employees. But there was something different in the air of the house. a tension he couldn't quite identify. It was in the third week after that early morning encounter that Walter began to notice changes in Vivian. His wife, who had always been attentive and interested in company affairs, now seemed irritated whenever he mentioned anything related to work. When he commented on an important new contract or problems with an employee, she would look away, respond in monosyllables, or simply change the subject. At first, Walter attributed it to stress. Vivian had always been an intense woman, with emotional highs and lows that he had learned to navigate over the years. But then came that Thursday afternoon. Walter had left the factory early because a meeting was cancelled last minute. As he entered the house, he heard Vivian's voice coming from the second-floor home office. She was on the phone, and the tone of her voice was different than usual. There was an urgency there, an excitement that made Walter freeze halfway up the stairs. He knew he shouldn't listen, that he should go up making noise to announce his arrival, but something kept him immobile, holding his breath. Vivian's words reached him in fragments. She was talking about finally getting what she deserved, about him not suspecting a thing, about everything going according to plan. Walter felt his blood run cold. Who was he in the conversation? What was she talking about? Vivian's voice had a quality he had never heard before, a mixture of excitement and complicity that left him nauseous. He stood there for a few more seconds before deliberately making noise as he ascended the remaining steps. When he entered the office, Vivian had already hung up and greeted him with a smile that seemed far too forced to be genuine. Walter didn't confront his wife at that moment. Something inside him, perhaps the same intuition that had made him successful in business, told him to wait, observe, and gather information before acting. He began to pay attention to small details that had previously gone unnoticed. Vivian was spending more time on the phone, always leaving the room he was in to answer calls. She had changed her cell phone password, something she had never done in all their years of marriage. Her outings became more frequent, always with vague excuses about commitments with girlfriends or necessary shopping trips. It was Elena who, inadvertently, delivered the first concrete clue. One Saturday morning, while preparing coffee, the cook casually mentioned that she had seen Vivian leaving a high-end bistro downtown the previous afternoon. The comment itself wouldn't have been significant, except for the fact that Vivian had told Walter she would be spending that entire afternoon at a luxury spa with her friends. Elena continued speaking, unaware of the tension gripping her boss's face. She said she was surprised to see Vivian accompanied by Marcus Thorne, the company's controller, and thought it was strange they were together during work hours. Marcus Thorne's name echoed in Walter's mind like an alarm bell. Marcus had worked with him for 5 years. He was responsible for all the factory's financial reports, had access to confidential information, bank accounts, and cash flow movements. He was discreet, efficient, and someone Walter trusted implicitly. The idea that Vivian and Marcus were meeting in secret planted a seed of suspicion that began to grow rapidly. Walter thanked Elena for the coffee and went up to his home office, closing the door behind him. He needed to think. He needed to understand what was happening. For the next few days, Walter forced himself to maintain normalcy. He went to the factory, conducted meetings, approved budgets, and spoke with Marcus as if nothing was amiss. But inside, a storm was brewing. He began reviewing old documents, financial reports from the past few months, looking for anything that seemed out of place. At first, everything appeared normal. The numbers balanced, profits were within expectation, and nothing immediately screamed fraud. But Walter was meticulous, and the more he looked, the more small inconsistencies began to surface. There were wire transfers that didn't make complete sense, small amounts leaving the company account with vague justifications. Individually, these values might have gone unnoticed, but together they began to form a worrying pattern. Walter spent entire nights in the Home Office, surrounded by stacks of paper, calculator in hand, trying to piece together the puzzle forming before his eyes. Exhaustion weighed on his shoulders, and he began to lose weight, his clothes hanging loosely on his once robust frame. Elena noticed the change in her boss. She saw the deep circles under his eyes, the way he pushed food around his plate without really eating, the tension that emanated from him like heat waves. The cook felt torn between the desire to help and the fear of meddling in affairs that were not hers, but she also couldn't ignore what she saw and heard. Working in the house practically every day now, she started noticing strange things. Vivian spent hours locked in the bedroom, whispering on the phone. When Elena entered to clean, Walter's wife would abruptly hang up and stare at her with a coldness that hadn't existed before. One Sunday afternoon, while Elena was preparing a special lunch Walter had requested, she needed to grab ingredients from the pantry. Reaching for a bag of flour on the high shelf, her hand brushed against something hidden behind the canned goods. It was a large, yellowed envelope. Curiosity overcame caution, and Elena opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were bank documents, account statements, and wire transfer receipts. She didn't fully understand what she was seeing, but the amounts caught her attention. They were considerable sums, moving from Walter and Vivian's joint account to an account she didn't recognize. Elena's heart pounded. She knew she shouldn't be looking at this, that she was invading her employer's privacy, but something stronger prevented her from simply putting everything back. There were dates on the documents, a sequence showing regular transfers happening for months. Elena photographed a few pages with her old cell phone, her hands shaking so much that she had to try several times to get clear images. Afterward, she put everything back exactly as she found it and returned to the kitchen, her heart beating so loudly she was sure everyone in the house could hear it. For the next few days, Elena carried that secret like a stone in her chest. She looked at Walter and saw a man slowly unraveling, consumed by worries he shared with no one. She looked at Vivian and saw a woman who smiled at her husband during dinner, but whose eyes were always calculating, always planning something. The cook wrestled with her internal conflict. Telling Walter about the documents could save him from something terrible, but it could also cost her job, turn him against her, and bring consequences she wasn't prepared to face. The decision came one night when Eleanor found Walter sitting alone in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. His head was buried in his hands, his shoulders bowed under the invisible weight he carried. Elena had come down for water as she was sleeping in the housekeeper's quarters that night. Seeing her boss in that state, something inside her broke. She pulled out a chair and sat beside him, saying nothing for a few minutes. Then, in a low but firm voice, she told him about the envelope in the pantry, the documents, and the suspicious transfers. Walter slowly raised his head, and Elena saw tears in the eyes of the man who had always seemed so strong, so unshakable. He didn't speak for a long time, only breathing heavily, as if each intake of air was a battle. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, loaded with a pain so profound it made Eleanor want to cry too. He asked her to show him the photos she had taken. Together, in that silent kitchen, illuminated only by the weak light over the stove, they looked at the images on Elena's old phone, and it was there, in that moment, that the truth began to take shape with terrible and undeniable contours. The next 3 days were the longest of Walter's life. He locked himself in the Home Office, refusing to speak to anyone except Elena. The cook went up several times a day, carrying trays of food that were barely touched, cups of coffee that grew cold, undrunk. She knocked gently, entered silently, left the tray on the paper-strewn desk, and left without asking questions. But their eyes met for brief seconds, and in that look there was a mute understanding, a silent support the CEO never would have expected to find in his own home. Walter spent those days immersed in the documents Elena had photographed, cross-referencing information with the company records he had brought home. Every new paper he analyzed revealed another layer of the betrayal. The transfers weren't random. There was a meticulous pattern, a careful plan that demonstrated months of preparation. Small amounts at first, values that could be mistaken for everyday expenses. Then gradually, the withdrawals increased, becoming bolder as no one questioned them. The total amount already exceeded $500,000, money that had been diverted from the joint account he held with Vivian, money that was supposed to secure their future. But it wasn't just the money that devastated Walter. It was the coldness of the planning, the methodical calculation of every move. He found notes in the margins of some statements, reminders in handwriting he immediately recognized as Marcus Thorne's. The controller wasn't just helping Vivian divert the money. He was orchestrating everything, using his intimate knowledge of the company's finances to identify loopholes, the right moments to make the transfers without raising suspicion. The betrayal was double, personal and professional, and each discovery was like a knife twist in Walter's gut. On the third day, Elena came up with another tray and found Walter with his face buried in his hands, his body shaking with silent sobs. She had never seen a man cry like that, with such pure and devastating pain. The cook set the tray aside and, in a gesture that surprised them both, placed her hand on his shoulder. Walter didn't pull away. On the contrary, he began to speak, the words pouring out as if a dam had broken inside him. He spoke of the 30 years dedicated to building the company, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the renunciations. He spoke of Vivian, how he loved her, about the 28 years of marriage that now seemed like a complete lie. Elena listened in silence, and when Walter finally fell quiet, exhausted, she spoke with surprising firmness. She said he couldn't fall apart now, that he needed to be strong, that he had 42 employees depending on him at the factory, 42 families who relied on him to support their homes. She reminded him that the company was much bigger than this betrayal, that his work meant something, that he couldn't let Vivian and Marcus destroy everything. Eleanor's words were like a splash of cold water, bringing Walter back to reality. He looked at this simple woman, his cook, and saw in her a strength he hadn't expected to find. It was Elena who suggested seeking legal help before confronting the traitors. Walter, still numb with pain, agreed without much conviction. The cook then mentioned she had a friend, Beatrice, who worked as an attorney at a small firm downtown. Beatrice had helped Elena's brother-in-law with a complicated fraud case a few years prior and was known for her discretion and competence. Walter initially hesitated, accustomed to dealing only with large corporate law offices, but eventually agreed to meet the lawyer. Elena made the contact, and 2 days later, Beatrice was sitting in Walter's home office, listening intently as he laid out the entire situation. Beatrice was 45, with greying hair, pulled back in a tight bun, and penetrating eyes that seemed to see right through people. She examined all the documents Walter had gathered with meticulous attention, making notes in an old legal pad. When she finished, she looked up and stated with a brutal frankness that Walter appreciated. The situation was severe, but there were legal avenues to recover the money and hold the culprits accountable. However, more evidence would be needed, every suspicious movement documented, a solid case built before any confrontation. Beatrice explained that acting hastily could give Vivian and Marcus time to hide even more money or destroy evidence. Walter agreed, and thus began one of the most painful periods of his life. For the next 3 months, he had to pretend he knew nothing, maintaining appearances both at home and at work. Every morning he woke up next to Vivian, saw her face on the pillow beside him, and felt nauseous. He had breakfast with her, talked about banalities, smiled when necessary, all while his heart bled internally. At the company, he had to interact with Marcus normally, approve reports, discuss strategies, as if he didn't know the man was systematically robbing him. The tension began to take its toll. Walter lost more weight. His clothes hung loose on his previously solid frame. His temples grew grayer, deep lines formed around his mouth. He began to suffer from chronic insomnia, spending entire nights staring at the dark ceiling of the bedroom, listening to Vivian's quiet breathing beside him, and feeling a mixture of rage and sorrow that threatened to consume him. During the day, exhaustion weighed on him like a lead blanket, making every decision a monumental effort. Elena became his only anchor in that sea of lies. She was always there, working silently in the kitchen, offering a word of encouragement when needed, a look of understanding when things got too difficult. The cook also had her own burdens to carry. Her daughter, Jessica, had discovered the situation through a conversation she overheard by chance, and since then had been pressuring her mother to quit and leave the house. Jessica feared what might happen when everything came to light, afraid that Vivian or Marcus might do something to her mother because she had revealed the documents. But Elena adamantly refused to abandon Walter at that moment. She felt a moral debt to him. The CEO had given her a second chance that early morning months ago when he could have easily fired her. More than that, she saw his suffering and couldn't simply turn her back. There was something deeply human in the connection that had formed between them, a mutual understanding that transcended differences in class and social position. Elena started working even longer hours, arriving earlier and leaving later, always alert for any detail that could help Walter build his case. It was during this period that Elena began to notice subtle changes in Vivian's behavior. Walter's wife was becoming more careless, more confident. Her phone conversations were less discreet. She left the house more often without giving detailed explanations. One afternoon, Elena heard her laughing loudly in the bedroom, a laugh of pure joy that seemed obscene considering the suffering she was causing. The cook reported everything to Walter in quick, furtive meetings in the office, each new piece of information adding to the sinister puzzle that was taking shape. Beatrice worked methodically behind the scenes, gathering official documents, requesting complete bank statements, building a detailed timeline of all suspicious transactions. She had hired a trusted forensic accountant to analyze the financial movements, and the results were even more alarming than Walter had imagined. The embezzlement was not limited to the joint account. Marcus had managed to gain access to company accounts and had been diverting small amounts from there too, values that individually looked like rounding errors, but which together amounted to a substantial sum. Walter was devastated to discover that the total loss exceeded $1 million. It wasn't just his marriage being destroyed, but also the financial health of the company he had built with such sacrifice. He thought of the 42 employees, their families, and how that stolen money could have been used for improvements, for bonuses, to ensure everyone's stability. Anger gradually began to replace sorrow, a cold, calculated rage that fueled him when despair threatened to overwhelm him. The investigative work also revealed the depth of the relationship between Vivian and Marcus. They met regularly in a rented apartment on the outskirts of Greenwood, a small, discreet place that Vivian paid for with the diverted money. Beatrice obtained copies of the lease agreement, payment receipts, even photographs of the two entering and leaving the building at times when they should have been working or attending other commitments. Each piece of evidence was like salt rubbed into an open wound, but Walter forced himself to look, to document, to save everything for the right moment. The tension at home became almost unbearable. Walter started sleeping in the office more frequently, claiming late work or international virtual meetings across different time zones. Vivian didn't question it much. In fact, she seemed pleased with the growing distance between them. Elena brought pillows and blankets to the office, prepared light meals Walter could eat while working. She became more than an employee. She was an ally, a confidant, someone he could completely trust in a world that seemed built on lies. During one of these nights in the office, Walter and Elena talked at length about life, choices, and trust. The cook shared her own past, about Jessica's father, who had abandoned them when the girl was only 2, about the difficulties she faced raising a daughter alone while working jobs that barely paid the bills. She spoke about how the opportunity to work for Walter had changed their lives, how for the first time she had been able to give her daughter basic things like a better school, decent clothes, and even a few sessions with a therapist for her anxiety. Walter, in turn, opened up about his own history. He recounted how he had started the factory from scratch with a small loan and great determination. He spoke about the early years of marriage with Vivian, when they were young and dreamed together, when she supported him unconditionally as he struggled to grow the company. He remembered happy moments, shared laughter, plans for the future that now felt like cold ash. The pain in his voice was palpable as he tried to understand when everything had changed, when Vivian had transformed into the woman capable of betraying him so completely. The next 2 months passed in a haze of constant vigilance and meticulous evidence gathering. Beatrice was satisfied with the material collected, confident they had a solid case. She began preparing the necessary legal documentation, drafting divorce petitions and civil lawsuits against Marcus. Walter reviewed everything with obsessive attention, wanting to ensure no detail was overlooked, no loophole left for the traitors to escape the consequences of their actions. It was then that something unexpected happened. One Saturday morning, Elena was organizing the pantry when she found another envelope, this one even more hidden than the first. Inside were documents showing that the embezzlement scheme had begun exactly 1 week after that early morning, when Walter had caught her with the medication. The cook immediately brought the envelope to Walter, her hands trembling as he examined the papers. The revelation that followed was like a punch to the gut. Vivian had set up everything. She had intentionally left the prescription bottle in a place where she knew Eleanor, desperate due to her daughter's situation, would eventually see it and succumb to temptation. The plan was simple and cruel. Make Walter catch the cook. Expect him to fire her immediately, as he would any employee who betrayed him. With Elena gone from the house, there would be no one left paying attention to the daily details, no one who might notice the strange movements, the whispered phone calls, the secret meetings. Vivian had calculated everything, using her husband's rigid character against him, betting on his natural distrust and his zero tolerance for betrayal. The irony was bitter and devastating. If Walter had acted as he always did, if he had fired Elena that early morning, he would never have discovered the truth until it was too late. It was precisely his moment of compassion, his decision to give the cook a second chance, that ended up saving everything. Elena had been kept in the house because Walter showed a moment of humanity, and it was this humanity that Vivian had failed to predict. The wife knew her husband's patterns well, his rigidity, his distrust, but she hadn't accounted for the possibility of him showing mercy. Walter held the documents with hands shaking with rage. He looked at Elena, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of his own shock. Everything had been planned, every detail carefully orchestrated. Vivian had used Elena's sick daughter, a mother's desperation, as a piece in her cruel game. She had turned a moment of human weakness into a trap, without caring about the consequences for anyone but herself. The malice of it, the calculated coldness, revealed a woman Walter realized he had never truly known. And in that moment, sitting in his office surrounded by evidence of the deepest betrayal he had ever experienced, something inside him finally broke completely, giving way to a cold, ruthless determination to see justice served, no matter the cost. The discovery of Vivian's carefully planned trap fundamentally changed Walter. The sorrow and despair that had consumed him in recent weeks were gradually replaced by a cold, controlled fury. He spent the following days reviewing every detail of the past months with new eyes, now seeing how meticulously his wife had manipulated everything. Every affectionate gesture she had made, every word of support, every tender smile, it all now seemed like a mask carefully constructed to hide the rot growing beneath. Beatrice was visibly shocked when Walter showed her the new documents. The attorney had handled many cases of marital betrayal throughout her career, but rarely had she seen something so calculated, so deliberately cruel. She spent an entire afternoon reorganizing the legal strategy, incorporating this new evidence into the already robust case they had built. The revelation that Vivian had set up a situation to force Walter to fire Eleanor showed clear premeditation, a level of planning that made the fraud even more serious in the eyes of the law. Elena, in turn, experienced her own crisis upon understanding how much she had been used. She who already felt guilty about that early morning, who had carried the weight of shame for months, now discovered she had been a pawn on a chessboard, manipulated by someone she had trusted. The cook spent days alternating between anger and deep sadness. Walter found her several times crying silently in the kitchen, wiping tears with the back of her hands while pretending to be busy preparing a meal. He tried to console her, saying none of it was her fault, but the words felt empty in the face of the magnitude of the betrayal they had both suffered. Jessica, Eleanor's daughter, intensified her pleas for her mother to quit the job. The 16-year-old feared the consequences when everything came to light, afraid that Vivian's rage would turn against them. But Elena held firm, telling her daughter that she couldn't abandon Walter at the moment he most needed someone he could trust. The arguments between mother and daughter became frequent and painful, each seeing the situation from different perspectives, each carrying their own fears and concerns. Work at the factory began to suffer due to Walter's emotional state. He tried to maintain appearances, but his concentration was compromised. He made small errors he would never normally make, forgot meetings, and took longer to make decisions that would previously have been automatic. Some employees started commenting among themselves about the change in their boss, worried about what might be happening. Marcus, always observant, also noticed the difference, but misinterpreted it as signs that Walter was too distracted to notice the ongoing diversions. Don't miss the next installments. Subscribe now, hit the bell icon, and tell us where you're watching from. Back to the story. It was during this period that Beatrice brought news that further complicated the situation. The forensic accountant she had hired discovered that the money diversion was even more extensive than they initially imagined. Marcus had created an elaborate network of shell corporations, using false documentation to issue fictitious invoices that justified the outflow of money from the factory. The scheme was sophisticated, showing that the controller had been planning this for much longer than the months of his relationship with Vivian. In fact, there was evidence that he had been preparing the groundwork for over 2 years, merely waiting for the right opportunity to execute the plan on a grand scale. The revelation left Walter stunned. 2 years. Marcus had been preparing this for 2 years, working by his side, earning his trust, patiently waiting for the moment to strike. And Vivian had joined him at some point in the process, seduced by the promise of easy money, or perhaps having been dissatisfied with the marriage for much longer than Walter realized. The CEO wondered obsessively when exactly his wife had crossed that line, when she had decided that cheating and stealing were acceptable, when the love he once felt for him had completely died. The nights in the office grew longer. Walter practically lived there now, only coming downstairs for quick meals that Elena insisted on preparing. The office was covered in papers, documents scattered across every available surface, colored markings highlighting suspicious transactions, lines connecting dates and amounts in a visual map of the systematic theft he had suffered. It was like assembling a macabre puzzle, each piece revealing another layer of the betrayal. Vivian started asking questions about the time Walter was spending locked in the office. Her questions had a tone of poorly disguised irritation, as if she were impatient with something. Walter responded vaguely about company problems, a large contract he was negotiating, complicated labor issues. She seemed to accept the explanations without much questioning, but there was something in her eyes that made him uncomfortable, a speculation he couldn't quite decipher. It was Elena who realized Vivian was starting to get nervous. The cook noticed small signs. Vivian biting her nails, something she had never done before. Her phone conversations becoming more tense, her voice rising when she thought no one was listening. The way she watched Walter during the rare meals they shared, her eyes following his every movement with an attention that bordered on paranoia. Elena reported everything to Walter, and together they tried to understand what could be making Vivian so agitated. The answer came from an unexpected source. Marcus made a mistake. After months of careful execution, he became overconfident and made a transfer during business hours, when he normally waited until late at night to move the money. A bank employee who knew Walter personally noticed the unusual transaction, and finding the amount and the timing strange, decided to call the factory to confirm. Marcus took the call, managed to deflect the bank employee's suspicions, but was visibly shaken by the incident. He rushed to tell Vivian, and it was this rushed, nervous conversation that Elena overheard by chance when she returned from the grocery store that afternoon. And in that moment, sitting in the office surrounded by evidence of the deepest betrayal he had ever experienced, something inside him finally broke completely, giving way to a cold, ruthless determination to see justice served, no matter the cost. Eleanor couldn't catch all the details, but she gathered enough to understand that something had gone wrong, that someone was asking questions, and that perhaps it was time to accelerate their plans. She rushed to tell Walter, who immediately called Beatrice. The attorney, realizing the traitors might be preparing to flee before they could gather all necessary evidence, made a quick decision. It was time to act, even if it meant sacrificing a few additional days of investigation. The following days were an intense scramble of final preparation. Beatrice worked late nights, preparing all the necessary legal documentation. She filed for divorce on Walter's behalf, including a request for an immediate freeze on all joint accounts. Simultaneously, she prepared civil and criminal lawsuits against Marcus, complete with copies of all the fraud evidence they had collected. She also included Vivian in the lawsuits related to the company's money diversion, as there was clear proof of her active participation in the scheme. Walter spent those days in a state of almost unbearable tension. He knew the confrontation was imminent, that soon he would have to look into the eyes of Vivian and Marcus and reveal that he knew everything. The anticipation was agonizing, but there was also a growing sense of relief. Months of pretense, of carrying that burden alone, were finally coming to an end. He could stop lying, stop smiling when he felt like screaming, stop sleeping beside a woman who had betrayed him in every possible way. Eleanor was equally tense, but for different reasons. She knew that when everything came out, her participation in discovering the fraud would be revealed. She feared Vivian's anger, feared possible retaliation, feared the unknown that would come next. But stronger than the fear was her sense of justice, the certainty that she was doing the right thing. She talked with Jessica every night, trying to prepare her daughter for what was coming, promising that everything would be all right, even though she wasn't absolutely sure of it herself. Beatrice scheduled the confrontation for a Monday morning at the factory office. She explained to Walter that it was important to do it on neutral territory with witnesses present to prevent any kind of violence or physical confrontation. Walter agreed, although a part of him wanted to do it at home, in the space Vivian had profaned with her lies. The attorney also insisted that Elena be present, both as a witness and as living proof of how Vivian had tried to manipulate the situation from the start. The Sunday before the confrontation was one of the longest days of Walter's life. He spent the whole day at home, watching Vivian go about her daily activities, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break upon her. She manicured her nails, watched television, talked on the phone with friends about trivialities. Walter watched her as if she were a stranger, trying to recognize in that woman the young person he had fallen in love with decades ago. He couldn't. The Vivian he had loved, if she had ever truly existed, had completely disappeared, replaced by this cold, calculating version he didn't know. That night, Vivian tried to start a conversation with Walter about plans for a trip they wanted to take. She spoke excitedly about destinations, hotels, and tours they could do. Walter listened with a sense of unreality, wondering how she could talk about the future when she was actively destroying the present. He gave vague answers, saying he needed to resolve some issues at the company before thinking about travel. Vivian frowned, irritated by the response, but didn't press the matter. When she finally went to sleep, Walter stayed awake, staring at the dark ceiling, counting the hours until dawn. Eleanor also couldn't sleep that night. She tossed and turned in her bed, thinking about everything that would happen in the next few hours, how their lives would completely change. She thought about Jessica, how to protect her daughter from the consequences of it all. She thought about Walter, how this man who once seemed so strong and unshakable had been broken inside. She thought about herself, the strange journey that had brought her from that early morning months ago, holding a prescription bottle with trembling hands, to this moment where she was about to witness the complete collapse of a family. When dawn broke, the sky was heavy with dark clouds, as if nature itself was preparing for the coming storm. Walter dressed carefully, choosing a dark suit he always wore for important occasions. His hands trembled slightly as he tied his tie, and he had to try 3 times before succeeding. At breakfast, Vivian commented on how formal he looked, and Walter replied that he had an important meeting at the company. It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't the whole truth. Elena arrived at the factory an hour before the scheduled time. Beatrice was already there, organizing documents into neat folders, each labeled with meticulous precision. The attorney greeted the cook with a nod, noticing the pallor of her face, the obvious nervousness in every movement. She offered water, suggested Elena sit down, and tried to calm her with reassuring words. But they both knew there was nothing calm about what was about to happen. Walter arrived next, his face a mask of determined calm that hid the turmoil of emotions underneath. He formally greeted Beatrice, looked at Elena with gratitude in his eyes, and then sat behind his desk in the office, the organized folders before him like ready ammunition. The clock on the wall marked the hours with agonizing slowness. At 8:30, Marcus Thorne arrived, cheerful and unconcerned as always, completely unaware of the trap that was about to close around him. Beatrice asked him to wait in the conference room, saying Walter wanted to discuss some important financial matters. Marcus agreed without suspicion, even making a joke about the bad weather outside. Then, promptly at 9 o'clock, Vivian arrived. Walter had asked her to come to the factory under the pretext of signing some documents related to their joint account. She arrived slightly irritated at being called there, but trying to disguise it with a forced smile. When Beatrice directed her to the same conference room where Marcus was waiting, the smile faltered. When she entered and saw the controller there, the expression on her face changed completely, and it was at that moment that Vivian knew something was terribly wrong. Walter walked into the conference room with Beatrice and Eleanor right behind him. The silence that settled was heavy, charged with a tension that seemed to suck the air out of the room. Vivian and Marcus were seated on opposite sides of the conference table, but their eyes met for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Walter to see the undisguised panic on both their faces. Vivian was the first to try to speak, her voice falsely cheerful as she asked what was happening, why Elena was there, why an attorney was present. Walter did not answer immediately. He sat at the head of the table, the organized folders before him, and for a long moment he just looked at the two traitors. Beatrice broke the silence, her voice professional and cold, as she formally introduced herself and explained that she was there representing Walter's interests in both marital and corporate matters. The words dropped like stones, and Vivian visibly paled. Marcus tried to stand up, saying he had work to do, but Beatrice firmly asked him to remain seated, informing him that the meeting was mandatory and that leaving could be interpreted as an admission of guilt. It was then that Walter finally spoke. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was a coldness in it that made even Elena shiver. He began with the early morning months ago, when he caught his cook with the prescription bottle. He described every detail of that night, watching confusion grow on Marcus's face, while Vivian grew paler and paler. Walter explained how that moment of compassion, that decision not to fire Elena immediately, had been the thread that began to unravel the entire plot carefully woven by his wife and his controller. Vivian tried to interrupt, her voice rising as she denied knowing what he was talking about, but Walter raised his hand, silencing her with a gesture. He continued, methodically describing every discovery, every document found, every bank transfer tracked. Beatrice began to open the folders, placing evidence on the table one by one. Bank statements, transfer receipts, photographs of Vivian and Marcus entering and leaving the rented apartment, copies of the lease agreement paid with diverted money, documents from the shell corporations Marcus had created. With each new piece of evidence presented, Marcus's face grew redder, beads of sweat starting to form on his forehead. He opened his mouth several times as if to speak, but no words came out. Vivian, on the other hand, attempted a different approach. She began to cry, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, saying Walter didn't understand, that things weren't as they seemed. Her voice was a sharp lament that echoed through the room, but her eyes kept calculating, searching for a way out, a way to reverse the situation. Walter let her cry for a few moments before continuing. He then revealed the most devastating discovery of all: how Vivian had deliberately set up the situation with the medication, using Elena's desperation and her daughter's illness as pawns in her cruel game. He explained how she had intentionally left the bottle visible, hoping Walter would catch the cook and fire her, thus eliminating the only person in the house who might notice the suspicious movements. When he finished speaking, an absolute silence took over the room. It was Elena who broke that silence. The cook, who until then had remained quiet in a corner of the room, stepped forward. Her voice initially trembled but gained strength as she looked directly at Vivian. Elena spoke about how she felt used, manipulated, turned into an instrument of someone else's malice. She described the nights she cried, thinking about her sick daughter, the guilt she carried for months, believing she had betrayed her boss's trust. And then, with a courage that surprised even herself, she looked at Vivian and said that she forgave her, not because Walter's wife deserved forgiveness, but because Elena refused to carry any more anger and bitterness inside her. Elena's words seemed to strike Vivian more profoundly than any of Walter's accusations. The mask finally dropped, completely. Vivian stopped crying suddenly, angrily wiped her tears, and looked at her husband with a distilled hatred that chilled his blood. She spat venomous words, saying he never valued her, that he always put the company first, that she deserved more than being the wife of a man married to his work. She spoke of years of loneliness, of dining alone, of social events where she attended unescorted because he was always busy with the factory. Walter listened without interruption, and when Vivian finally fell silent, exhausted by her own rage, he replied in a weary voice. He admitted that perhaps he hadn't been the best husband, that he had indeed dedicated too much time to the company. But then, with a firmness that allowed no contest, he said that this did not justify cheating, it did not justify stealing, and it did not justify the calculated cruelty with which she had acted. If she was unhappy in the marriage, she could have asked for a divorce. If she needed money, she could have talked to him. But she chose the path of lies and theft, and now she would have to face the consequences. Marcus, seeing that there was no way left to deny the evidence, attempted a different approach. He began to blame Vivian for everything, saying she had seduced him, that the whole plan had been her idea, that he was merely a victim of a desperate woman's manipulations. The words poured out in a torrent, a pathetic attempt to save himself by throwing all the blame onto his partner in crime. Vivian turned to him with a look of absolute disbelief, and then began to scream, accusing him of being a coward, a liar, revealing intimate details of their relationship in an attempt to drag Marcus down with her. The argument between the two traitors was degrading to witness. They accused each other, revealing secrets, exposing weaknesses, tearing down any facade of complicity they might have shared. Beatrice allowed them to continue for a few minutes, knowing that every word was an additional confession, more evidence that could be used in the legal proceedings. When she finally intervened, demanding silence, her voice cut through the air like a blade. The attorney then methodically explained the lawsuits that would be initiated. Against Vivian, a divorce petition with a demand for the full return of all diverted money, in addition to criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Against Marcus, termination for cause, civil and criminal lawsuits for fraud, document forgery, and the establishment of shell corporations. Beatrice explained that she had already requested a freeze on all joint accounts belonging to Walter and Vivian, as well as the accounts of the shell corporations Marcus had created. The money that had not yet been moved would be frozen until the cases were resolved. Vivian attempted one last, desperate maneuver. She dramatically stood up, pointed at Eleanor, and accused her of fabricating the evidence, of lying to Walter, of inventing everything in an attempt to cause trouble in the marriage. It was such an absurd accusation, considering the volume of banking and photographic documentation presented, that Beatrice almost laughed. The attorney simply picked up one of the folders and showed Vivian the dated and certified photographs of her entering and exiting the secret apartment, the bank statements with her signature authorizing the transfers, the rent payment receipts. It was then that Marcus finally broke completely. He buried his head in his hands and began to weep, not tears of remorse, but of pure self-pity. He pleaded with Walter for a second chance, promising to return all the money, saying he had made a terrible mistake, that he would never do such a thing again. Walter looked at the man who had worked by his side for 5 years, the man he had trusted with his company's finances, and felt only profound disappointment. There was no rage, no desire for vengeance, just immense exhaustion and the certainty that some betrayals could not be forgiven. Beatrice concluded the meeting by informing them that both would receive official notifications of the lawsuits in the coming days. She recommended they seek defense counsel, as the evidence was solid, and the cases would proceed regardless of any attempt at settlement or negotiation. When she finished speaking, she gestured for Vivian and Marcus to leave. Marcus walked out first, stumbling slightly, his once confident posture now bowed under the weight of shame and fear of what was to come. Vivian, however, stood still for a few more seconds, looking at Walter with an expression that mixed hatred, contempt, and something that might have been remorse had she been capable of such an emotion. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then simply closed it again. With one last venomous look at Elena, she exited the room, her high heels echoing in the empty factory corridor. The door closed behind her with a definitive sound, and for the first time in months, Walter felt he could fully breathe. But the sense of relief was short-lived. As soon as they were alone in the room, Walter felt his legs give way. He clung to the table, his face losing all color, and he would have collapsed had Eleanor not rushed forward to support him. The cook helped him sit down again. Beatrice hurried to fetch water. Walter drank in small sips, his hands trembling so much that Eleanor had to hold the glass for him. Months of tension, of pretense, of carrying that weight alone, had finally taken their toll. Beatrice suggested Walter take the rest of the day off, that he go home to rest, but he adamantly refused. He didn't want to go back to that house, not now, perhaps never. Instead, he asked Elena to take him to the private office he kept at the factory, a small room in the back where he sometimes spent the night during tight deadlines. The cook agreed, and along with Beatrice they helped him walk down the hallway, ignoring the curious glances of employees who were starting to arrive for another day of work. In the office, Walter finally allowed the emotions he had suppressed for so long to surface. He cried as he hadn't cried since childhood, deep sobs that shook his entire body. He cried for the loss of his marriage, for the betrayal by people he trusted, for the years wasted with someone who never truly loved him. He cried for the naivete of believing he was building a future with Vivian when she was merely waiting for the right opportunity to destroy everything. Elena stayed by his side, a hand resting on his shoulder, offering the silent comfort of her presence. When the tears finally ceased, Walter felt strangely empty, as if he had been drained of everything that composed him. Beatrice had left to begin processing the legal paperwork, promising to keep him informed of every step of the proceedings. Elena remained, and it was she who finally broke the silence. She told Walter that she knew the coming months would be difficult, that the legal battle would be long and painful, but that he wasn't alone. She said she would be there, not just as an employee, but as a friend, as someone who understood his pain, because she too had been used and manipulated by Vivian. Elena's words brought Walter a small measure of comfort. He looked at this simple woman, his cook, who had worked silently in the house for 7 years, and realized she had become the most important person in his life over the past few months. It was she who kept him sane during the darkest period, she who had the courage to reveal the truth, even risking her own job, she who remained loyal when everyone else betrayed him. Walter felt a wave of gratitude so profound it almost brought fresh tears to his eyes. The following days were a blur of legal activity. Beatrice worked tirelessly, filing petitions, requesting hearings, coordinating with the forensic accountant to document every penny diverted. Official notifications were delivered to Vivian and Marcus, who hired their own lawyers and began mounting their defenses. Vivian initially tried to deny everything, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Her lawyer recommended a change in strategy, attempting to argue that she was a victim of Marcus's manipulation, that she didn't fully understand what she was doing. Marcus, in turn, tried to negotiate a settlement. He offered to return part of the money in exchange for reduced charges, but Beatrice categorically refused. Walter had been clear. He wanted complete justice. He wanted both to face the full consequences of their actions. The controller then tried to blame family issues, personal debts, and extenuating circumstances that could justify his acts. But the sophistication of the fraud scheme, the meticulous planning that had lasted years, made it impossible to argue that it had been a momentary mistake or an impulsive decision. While the legal battles unfolded, Walter had to deal with the practical consequences of the situation. The story leaked, as was inevitable in a town the size of Greenwood. Factory employees commented in whispers. Acquaintances offered clumsy condolences. Some looked at him with pity that made his stomach churn. He hated being the subject of gossip. He hated seeing his private life become public entertainment. But he forced himself to hold his head high, to keep working, to show that he would not be broken by this. The company suffered an initial blow when news of the fraud spread. Some clients questioned the factory's reliability, worried about financial stability after the fund diversion. Walter had to give detailed presentations, showing that the company remained solid, that steps had been taken to recover the stolen money, and that new internal controls were being implemented. It was an exhausting but necessary period to preserve the reputation he had built over 3 decades. Elena continued working at the house, but the atmosphere was completely different now. Vivian had moved out to a small apartment, taking only her clothes and some personal belongings. The large house felt empty, echoing with heavy silences. Walter rarely stayed there, preferring to sleep at the factory office or a nearby hotel. When he went to retrieve documents or clothes, he felt like a ghost wandering through a place that was no longer his home. Elena tried to keep everything clean and organized, as if domestic normalcy could somehow fix what was broken, but they both knew it was a futile effort. And then, on a rainy afternoon in August, 4 months after the initial confrontation, came news that changed everything again. Beatrice called Walter with urgency in her voice, asking him to come immediately to her office. When he arrived, he found the attorney with an expression he couldn't decipher. She held an envelope, and her hands trembled slightly as she handed it to Walter. Inside were documents that revealed something none of them had anticipated, a twist so unexpected that it made everything that had happened until then seem only the prologue to a much larger, darker story. Walter opened the envelope with shaking hands, his heart racing without yet understanding why. The documents inside were copies of old bank records, some dating back more than 10 years. Beatrice explained that the forensic accountant, upon deepening the investigation into Marcus's financial movements, had discovered something disturbing. The diversion scheme hadn't started 2 years ago, as they initially thought. It had been happening since Marcus first started working at the company 5 years prior, but so discreetly, with such small amounts, that it had gone completely unnoticed. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The forensic accountant had traced where these initial diversions went and discovered they didn't go into Marcus's accounts. They went into an account in Vivian's name, an account she had secretly opened years before starting the relationship with the controller. The revelation left Walter stunned. This meant that Vivian hadn't joined Marcus's scheme. She had been the mastermind from the start. She had been the one who recruited the controller, the one who planned everything, the one who orchestrated every move. Marcus wasn't the brains of the operation, as everyone had assumed. He was merely a tool in Vivian's hands. Beatrice continued explaining, her voice controlled, but with a tone of growing indignation. Vivian had met Marcus at a company event shortly before he was hired. In fact, there was evidence suggesting she influenced Walter to specifically hire that controller, planting subtle praise, mentioning his qualifications in casual conversations, guiding her husband to the decision she wanted. Everything had been planned years in advance, a manipulation so deep and calculated that it sent a chill down his spine. Walter felt as if the floor were disappearing beneath his feet. He had always known Vivian had cheated and stolen, but now he understood that the extent of the betrayal went far beyond what he had imagined. His wife hadn't made a mistake. She hadn't been carried away by a moment of weakness or sudden passion. She had systematically planned to destroy him for years, working patiently, waiting for the right moment, using his trust against him in every possible way. The pain of this revelation was much deeper than anything he had felt until then. Don't miss the next installments. Subscribe now, hit the bell icon, and tell us where you're watching from. Back to the story. Beatrice placed more documents on the table. There were records of communications between Vivian and Marcus, dating back to even before his hiring. She had deliberately sought him out, seduced him not only romantically but also with the promise of easy money, molding him into the perfect tool for her plan. The controller, whom Walter had despised as a traitor, was actually almost as much a victim as Walter himself, manipulated by a woman who clearly had a talent for identifying people's weaknesses and using them to her advantage. The attorney explained that this new evidence completely changed the dynamic of the legal proceedings. Vivian now faced much graver charges, including long-term conspiracy and criminal association. The penalty she could receive would be significantly higher. Marcus, on the other hand, could potentially argue that he had been coerced and manipulated, although he was still guilty due to his active participation in the scheme. Beatrice recommended that Walter prepare for an even longer and more complicated legal process than they had anticipated. Walter left the attorney's office in a state of shock. He drove aimlessly through the streets of Greenwood for hours, trying to process everything he had discovered. How could he have been so blind? How had he not realized he was being manipulated for so long? He remembered moments over the years, small incidents that now took on new meaning. Times when Vivian had insisted he hire certain people or make specific business decisions. How many of those suggestions had been part of her plans? How many times had she subtly guided him in directions that benefited her schemes? When he finally returned to the factory, it was already night. He found Elena still there, waiting for him in the private office. The cook had been worried when Beatrice called, saying Walter had left visibly shaken. She had prepared tea and some simple sandwiches, knowing he likely hadn't eaten all day. Walter sat down heavily in the chair and told Elena about the new discoveries. The cook listened in silence, her face paling as she understood the depth of the betrayal. Elena then revealed something she herself had been thinking about in recent weeks. She said that now, looking back, she remembered small moments when Vivian had made strange comments about Walter and the company, comments that seemed innocent at the time, but now took on a sinister tone. Vivian had asked several times about Walter's routine, about how much time he spent in the office reviewing documents, about how involved he was in the company's financial details. Elena had answered casually, not thinking she was providing information Vivian would use to better plan her diversions. Guilt consumed Elena as she spoke. She felt that she had, even if unintentionally, helped Vivian rob Walter. Tears began to stream down her face as she apologized repeatedly. Walter, seeing the cook's genuine distress, did something that surprised them both. He stood up, walked over to her, and hugged her. He said none of it was her fault, that Vivian was an expert manipulator who had deceived everyone, and that Elena had been used just as much as he had. The hug was comforting for both, a moment of human connection amidst the chaos. The following days brought more revelations as the forensic accountant continued unearthing layers of Vivian's scheme. It was discovered that she had also manipulated Walter's business decisions over the years, suggesting contracts that benefited companies where Marcus could easily divert money, influencing the choice of suppliers who charged inflated prices from which she received secret commissions. The web of corruption was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Walter went through moments of deep depression during this period. There were days when he could barely get out of bed, the weight of the betrayal and humiliation crushing any will to continue. He questioned everything about his life, his choices, his judgment of character. If he had been so completely deceived by someone he lived with for nearly 3 decades, how could he ever trust his own discernment again? How could he look at anyone and believe they were genuine? It was Elena who kept him functional during these darkest times. She arrived early every morning, prepared strong coffee, and forced him to eat at least something small. She talked to him about everyday things, about her daughter Jessica, who was doing better in school, about small daily victories that seemed insignificant but maintained a semblance of normalcy. The cook became the anchor that prevented Walter from completely losing himself in the sea of pain and despair. Jessica, Eleanor's daughter, also played an unexpected role during this period. The 16-year-old, who had previously feared the situation, now saw Walter as someone who also needed help. She began visiting him occasionally, bringing books from the library she thought he might like, or simply sitting quietly doing her homework while he worked. Jessica's youthful, innocent presence brought a lightness to the heavy atmosphere Walter carried with him. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings advanced. Vivian's lawyer tried to argue that the new evidence had been illegally obtained, but Beatrice demonstrated that everything had been discovered through legitimate forensic investigation of the company accounts to which Walter had full access rights. The defense attempt was rejected. Vivian then changed tactics, trying to claim she suffered from psychological issues that impaired her judgment, but court-ordered psychiatric evaluations found no evidence of any condition that could justify or explain her actions. Marcus, realizing Vivian was trying to shift all the blame onto him to save herself, decided to cooperate fully with the authorities. He provided detailed testimony about how Vivian had recruited him, how she had planned every step, and how she was the true mastermind behind everything. His testimony, combined with the documentary evidence, painted a devastating portrait of Vivian as a calculated manipulator with no genuine remorse for her actions. The Greenwood community was shocked by the revelations. Vivian had been seen by many as a dedicated wife, active in social events, always smiling and elegant. Discovering that behind this facade was a woman capable of such prolonged manipulations shook many people. Some of Vivian's acquaintances gave interviews to local papers, expressing disbelief and personal betrayal upon learning that she had lied to them too during all those years. Walter had to deal not only with his own emotional wounds, but also with the public shame of having been so thoroughly deceived. There were people who blamed him, saying he should have paid more attention, that the signs were all there. These comments cut deeply, adding layers of pain to an already devastating situation. But there were also those who supported him, loyal factory employees who organized a show of support, longtime clients who sent messages of solidarity. It was during this tumultuous period that Walter began to notice changes in himself. The pain hadn't disappeared. It probably never would completely, but he was starting to find strengths he didn't know he possessed. The initial destructive rage was transforming into a cold determination to rebuild his life. He began spending more time at the factory, not just hiding from the world, but genuinely engaging with the work, reconnecting with the passion that had motivated him to build the company in the first place. Elena noticed these changes with cautious hope. She saw Walter gradually reclaiming pieces of himself, the man he was, before all the betrayal began emerging again, still wounded but not broken. The cook continued her quiet, dedicated work, but now there was a different dimension to her relationship with Walter. They had gone through one of the darkest periods anyone could face together, and this had created a bond that transcended employer and employee. The preliminary hearings began 6 months after the initial confrontation. Beatrice had built an absolutely solid case, every allegation supported by multiple pieces of documentary evidence. Vivian attended the hearings impeccably dressed, maintaining a facade of dignity, but the cracks in her mask were visible to anyone who looked closely. Marcus looked like a broken man, his shoulders slumped, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. During one of the hearings, Vivian looked directly at Walter for the first time in months. There was something in her eyes he couldn't quite identify. Regret, defiance, anger at being caught, perhaps a mixture of all of it. Walter held her gaze without blinking, and it was in that moment that he realized something fundamental. She no longer held any power over him. The woman who had manipulated him for years, who had controlled aspects of his life he hadn't even known about, was now just a stranger facing the consequences of her choices. The main hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks away, and that would be when the judge would hear the final arguments and make preliminary rulings on the charges. Beatrice was confident, but warned Walter to prepare for possible appeals and delays that could prolong the process for more months, perhaps years. Walter accepted this reality with weary resignation. He had learned that justice was a slow process, that healing was even slower, and that some wounds might never fully close. But amidst all the pain and destruction, there were also moments of unexpected light. Factory employees who had worked with him for years began sharing stories about how Walter had helped them during difficult times. Personal, interest-free loans he had made to help with medical emergencies, flexibility he had shown when they needed to care for sick family members. He had forgotten many of these moments, But for those people, they had meant the difference between despair and hope. Elena organized a small surprise gathering at the factory where employees could personally express their support for Walter. It was a deeply moving moment that brought tears to the CEO's eyes. He realized that although Vivian had destroyed his marriage and stolen his money, she hadn't managed to touch the most important thing he had built: genuine relationships with people who respected not his wealth, but his character and integrity. That night, after everyone had left, Walter stood alone in his office, looking out the window at the sleeping town of Greenwood. For the first time in months, he felt something akin to peace. It wasn't happiness, far from it, but it was a quiet acceptance that he would survive this, that on the other side of all the pain and betrayal, a life was waiting to be rebuilt. And that perhaps, just perhaps, this new life could be better than the old one, built on truth instead of lies, on genuine connections instead of hidden manipulations. The morning of the final hearing arrived under a heavy grey sky, as if nature itself reflected the tension hanging over everyone involved. Walter woke up early in the small apartment he had rented after finally accepting that he could no longer live in that house filled with contaminated memories. Elena had insisted on preparing him a special breakfast, arriving even before sunrise, to ensure he ate something before the long day ahead. As they drank coffee together in that modest kitchen, so different from the large house where everything had begun, Walter looked at Elena and felt deep gratitude. Over the past 8 months, since that fateful early morning when he found her with the prescription bottle in her hands, she had been his only constant. In a world that crumbled around him, where truths turned out to be lies and trusted people revealed the faces of traitors, Elena remained steadfast, loyal, and genuine. She, who had every reason to harbor resentment for being used as a pawn in Vivian's cruel game, chose forgiveness and compassion. Beatrice met them at the courthouse door. The attorney was impeccably dressed, carrying a voluminous brief with all the case documents. Her eyes showed the determination of someone who had spent months building an irrefutable case. She greeted Walter with a confident nod and Elena with a warm smile. The cook would be called as a witness, a role that made her nervous but which she had accepted without hesitation when Beatrice explained her importance to the case. The courtroom was packed. The story had captured the attention of the entire Greenwood community, and many curious onlookers came to witness the outcome. Walter saw familiar faces in the gallery, employees from his factory, long-time clients, even some business competitors who came to observe the downfall of one of the city's most respected CEOs. The murmur of conversations ceased when Vivian entered, escorted by her attorney. She wore a discreet suit, her hair pulled back, minimal makeup, clearly trying to project an image of respectability and regret. Marcus entered shortly after, looking even smaller and more defeated than in previous hearings. He avoided looking at anyone, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. His attorney, a young man clearly overwhelmed by the case's complexity, nervously shuffled papers. The difference between the two defenses was stark. Vivian had hired one of the region's most expensive lawyers, likely using some of the money she had stolen, while Marcus had barely managed to pay for basic representation. The judge entered, and the session began. Beatrice presented her case with surgical precision, every argument supported by multiple pieces of documentary evidence. She detailed the complete chronology of the scheme, from the first subtle diversions 5 years ago to the bolder transfers of recent months. She showed how Vivian had recruited and manipulated Marcus, how she had set up the medication situation to try and eliminate Elena from the house, and how she had influenced Walter's business decisions over the years to facilitate her thefts. Vivian's defense attempted to argue that she was a neglected wife, that years of loneliness had led her to make poor decisions. Her lawyer painted a portrait of a woman desperate for attention, who got involved with Marcus, seeking emotional connection, and was only gradually dragged into the financial scheme. It was an elaborate narrative, But it crumbled when Beatrice presented evidence that the first diversions occurred long before any romantic involvement between Vivian and Marcus, proving that the motivation was always money, not loneliness or emotional neglect. When it was Elena's turn to testify, the room fell into absolute silence. The cook walked to the front with hesitant steps, her hands trembling slightly as she took the oath. Beatrice guided her gently through her testimony, starting with the early morning when she was caught with the medication. Elena described her desperation for her sick daughter, her shame upon being discovered, and Walter's unexpected compassion in giving her a second chance. Then she recounted the following months, how she began to notice strange behaviors in Vivian, the envelope she found hidden in the pantry, and the internal conflict that tormented her before she decided to tell Walter about her discoveries. Her voice choked when she described the devastation on her boss's face when he understood the extent of the betrayal. And finally, with a courage that made Walter feel immense pride, she looked directly at Vivian and described the revelation that the entire medication situation had been a deliberate trap. Vivian's attorney tried to discredit Elena during cross-examination, suggesting she had motive to invent stories, that she was protecting her job, and that she had a personal interest in seeing Vivian convicted. But Elena's genuine sincerity was impossible to deny. She answered every question with simple, direct honesty, never exaggerating, never embellishing, just telling the truth as she had lived it. When she finally returned to her seat beside Walter, she was trembling, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Marcus was called next. His testimony was a painful confirmation of everything Beatrice had argued. He described how Vivian had initially approached him, how she seduced him not only romantically, but also with the vision of a better life financially. He recounted the first small diversions, how Vivian encouraged him to be bolder, how she planned every move while he executed. His voice was monotone, defeated, the voice of a man who had lost everything and knew he deserved the consequences. During Marcus's testimony, Walter observed Vivian. He saw the mask completely shatter when the controller revealed intimate details of how she had manipulated him. Anger flashed across her face, quickly followed by poorly disguised panic. She furiously whispered something to her attorney, who merely shook his head negatively. There was no more denying it. There were no more plausible excuses. The truth was there, exposed for all to see, inescapable and damning. When it was Walter's turn to testify, he took the stand with a calmness that surprised even himself. For months he had imagined this moment, thinking he would be consumed by rage or pain. But now, looking at the packed courtroom, seeing Vivian sitting there trying to maintain her facade, he felt only a deep weariness. Beatrice guided him through questions about the history of the marriage, his trust in Vivian, and the impact of the betrayal both personally and financially. Walter spoke about the 30 years dedicated to building the company, about the 42 employees and their families who depended on the factory for survival. He described the pain of discovering that the money meant to secure everyone's future was being systematically stolen by someone he trusted completely. He spoke about sleepless nights, about the weight loss, about moments when the depression was so profound he questioned whether life was worth continuing. But then, and his voice gained strength as he said this, he spoke about the people who supported him, about Elena, who risked her job to reveal the truth, about Beatrice, who fought tirelessly for justice, about the factory employees who showed loyalty when he needed it most, about Jessica, Elena's daughter, a young woman he barely knew, but who brought lightness to his darkest days with her innocent and genuine presence. He said that the betrayal had taken much from him, but it had also revealed something precious, the unexpected kindness of people who had no obligation to help him but chose to do so anyway. When Vivian's attorney attempted cross-examination, Walter answered every question with brutal honesty. Yes, he had dedicated too much time to work. Yes, perhaps he hadn't been the most attentive husband, but no, that did not justify years of calculated manipulation and systematic theft. He admitted his mistakes without hesitation, but made it clear that his flaws as a husband did not give Vivian the right to destroy everything he had built and jeopardize the livelihoods of dozens of families. After the testimonies, the closing arguments followed. Vivian's attorney made one last desperate attempt to humanize his client, speaking about her difficult childhood, social pressures, and a society that overvalues money and status. It was an eloquent but empty argument, disconnected from the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and calculated manipulation. Beatrice, in turn, kept her closing argument simple and direct. The evidence spoke for itself. The case was clear. Justice needed to be served. The judge announced he would deliver his verdict after a brief recess. The 30-minute wait was agonizing. Walter, Elena, and Beatrice stayed in a small adjoining room, no one speaking much, each lost in their own thoughts. Elena held Walter's hand, a simple gesture that brought more comfort than she probably realized. When they were finally called back, Walter's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. He began by speaking about the gravity of the case, how betrayals of trust in personal and professional relationships corroded the fabric of society. Then, methodically, he went through each charge. For Vivian, guilty of fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and document forgery, the sentence would be substantial, years in prison, in addition to the obligation to fully restitute all stolen money with interest and penalties. For Marcus, guilty of the same charges, but with mitigating circumstances, considering the manipulation he suffered, his sentence would be lesser, but still significant. When the judge struck the final gavel, Vivian finally broke down. She began to cry. Not the calculated tears she had used before, but genuine sobs from a woman who finally understood that she had lost everything. Her attorney tried to console her, but she pushed him away. Marcus simply lowered his head, accepting his fate with silent resignation. The room erupted in murmurs, and security had to call for order. Outside the courthouse, local media awaited statements. Beatrice gave a brief official statement, thanking the court and reiterating that the law had prevailed. Walter refused to speak to reporters. He had no energy for it. He just wanted to go home, to the small but honest apartment that was now his refuge, and process everything that had happened. In the following days, life began to assume a new normal. The money that would be recovered through the process would take time, but at least there was a clear path ahead. The factory, which had suffered during the turbulent months, began to stabilize. Walter implemented new, rigorous financial controls, hiring a full-time forensic accountant to ensure nothing similar could happen again. The employees, seeing his commitment to protecting the company and their jobs, worked with renewed dedication. Elena continued working for Walter, but now in an expanded capacity. He recognized that she had a natural talent for organization and attention to detail, and began giving her administrative responsibilities in the company in addition to her domestic duties. She accepted the challenge with enthusiasm, studying at night to learn about business management, determined not to disappoint the trust Walter placed in her. Jessica, Elena's daughter, also flourished. With her anxiety properly treated and the situation at home stable, she excelled in school. Walter, seeing the young woman's potential, offered her a scholarship to attend a better private school. It was a gesture that brought tears to Elena's eyes, as she had never imagined being able to provide such an opportunity for her daughter. 3 months after the sentencing, Walter did something that surprised everyone. He sold the large house where he had lived with Vivian, that space filled with contaminated memories. With part of the money, he bought a smaller but cozy house in a quiet neighborhood of Greenwood. It wasn't ostentatious. It wasn't meant to impress anyone. It was simply a home where he could rebuild his life on honest foundations. Walter invited Elena and Jessica to the housewarming. It was a small, intimate celebration, just a few close factory employees and Beatrice. As everyone talked and laughed, sharing simple but delicious food Elena had prepared, Walter looked around and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: genuine contentment. It wasn't the explosive, naive happiness of before. It was something deeper and more mature, a peace that came from knowing the difference between appearances and truth. Don't miss the next installments. Subscribe now, hit the bell icon, and tell us where you're watching from. Back to the story. That night, after everyone had left, Walter and Elena stood on the porch of the new house, watching the stars in the clear greenwood sky. They talked about the long road they had traveled since that early morning months ago. Elena commented that it was strange how something as terrible as being caught with those medications had, in the end, saved both their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. Walter agreed, reflecting on how his moment of compassion, his decision to give Elena a second chance when every instinct told him to fire her, had been the choice that saved everything. If he had acted as he always did, if he had let his distrust and rigidity guide his actions, Vivian would have managed to execute her plan perfectly. It was his humanity, that spark of empathy he had nearly lost after years of disappointment, that turned out to be his salvation. They spoke about forgiveness, about how Elena had managed to forgive Vivian for using her so cruelly. The cook explained that forgiving didn't mean forgetting or saying that what Vivian did was right. It meant refusing to carry the weight of hatred. It meant choosing to move forward instead of being trapped in bitterness. It was a lesson Walter was slowly learning, though he knew it would take much more time for him to reach the same level of peace Elena seemed to have found. Walter also spoke about the lessons he had learned through all that suffering, about the importance of paying attention not just to grand gestures, but to the small signs, about how wealth and material success were hollow without genuine human connections, about how the most important people in his life ended up being those he least expected: a simple cook who worked quietly by his side for years, her teenage daughter who brought innocent joy to his darkest days, an attorney from a modest firm who fought for him when larger firms would have charged fortunes. As the months passed, Walter began to rebuild not only his practical life, but also his ability to trust. It was a slow and painful process, full of setbacks and moments of doubt. But gradually, with the support of Elena and the other genuine people who entered his life, he began to believe again that not everyone hid ulterior motives, that genuine kindness existed in the world. The factory prospered under his renewed leadership. Walter, having learned that work shouldn't consume an entire life, began to delegate more, to trust his team, to allow others to help carry the weight. He instituted better benefits programs for employees, created an emergency fund to help those facing medical or family crises. He made the company not just a business, but a community. 1 year after that fateful early morning, Walter organized a special dinner. He invited everyone who had supported him through the darkest period: Elena and Jessica, Beatrice, a few loyal factory employees. It was a night of gratitude and celebration, not of the victory in court, but of survival, resilience, and the human kindness that emerged even in the darkest circumstances. During the dinner, Walter made a toast. He spoke about how a year ago he was at his lowest point, believing he had lost everything. But he discovered that the things that truly mattered, that truly made life worthwhile, could not be stolen. The capacity to love, to trust again despite being betrayed, to find light even in the deepest darkness. He specifically thanked Elena, saying she not only saved his company by revealing the fraud, but saved his very humanity by showing that compassion and loyalty still existed in the world. Elena, with tears in her eyes, responded that she also had much to be grateful for. That Walter had given her not just a second chance that distant morning, but had believed in her when she needed it most. He had treated her and her daughter not as subordinates, but as people worthy of respect and opportunity, and that through all the suffering she had discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed. She had grown in ways she never imagined possible. As the night progressed and conversations flowed, Walter looked around the table and realized something profound. He had lost a marriage based on lies, but he had gained a chosen family built on truth. He had lost money that could be recovered, but he had gained wisdom that was priceless. He had passed through the fire of betrayal and suffering, but he had emerged on the other side not broken, but forged into something stronger, more genuine, and more human. The story of Walter and Elena became known in Greenwood as an example of resilience and the importance of second chances. People facing their own betrayals and difficulties found hope in knowing that it was possible to survive, possible to rebuild, possible to find light even after the deepest darkness. And at the heart of it all was that simple decision Walter had made one early morning months ago, choosing compassion over judgment, choosing humanity over rigidity. Years later, when Walter looked back at that period of his life, he saw not only the pain and betrayal, but also the transformation. He saw how he had been broken and rebuilt, how he had lost a life based on appearances and gained a life based on truth. He saw how the worst thing that had ever happened to him had also, paradoxically, been the catalyst for him to become a better person, more conscious, more grateful for the things that truly mattered. And always, always, he remembered that early morning when he came home and found Elena holding that prescription bottle. That moment could have been the start of yet another firing, yet another betrayal in his life, but instead, it became the moment his humanity saved not only someone else's life, but his own. It was the moment he learned that sometimes the right thing to do is not to follow the rules, but to follow the heart. And that, in the end, it is the compassion we show in the most difficult moments that defines who we truly are. The sun set over Greenwood on that night of celebration, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. And in the small house Walter had built on foundations of truth and honesty, surrounded by people who genuinely cared for him, he finally found what he had been searching for his entire life: peace. Not the superficial peace of a life without problems, but the profound peace of a life lived with integrity, gratitude, and real human connections. It was a happy ending, not because everything was perfect, but because he had learned to value what truly mattered. And in that, there was a hope that no betrayal could steal,